Well, hello and welcome to this third installment of our Symphonic Lit COVID edition. Today we're going to talk about nationalism, and we're going to talk about nationalism through a lens where we're going to look at maybe two of the most popular composers of the 19th century in terms of some of their works that continue to be played to this day. Nationalism, when it comes to music, deals with the use of traditional folk idioms. And this could be folk melodies, dance rhythms, very popular, but also unique harmonies that could be based on scales that are unique to a certain population. And frequently these are associated with a nationalist movement, either for political or cultural or both independence and governing. And today we're going to look at Smetana and also Dvorak, two people that have been sort of yoked with this term of nationalism. And but before we do that, the last video I talked extensively about Tchaikovsky. And one of the things that we talked about with Tchaikovsky was his quest to bridge the Russian nationalist movement, which was closely associated with the mighty handful of composers. There was five: Balakirev, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Cui, and a fifth one. I guess Rimsky-Korsakov would be maybe the most performed of the nationalist composers, and his work Scheherazade is one that I've used in this class in the past as a way to illustrate unique sounds. Whether it's, in the case of that particular work, we're dealing with things that sound like they're from the Middle or Far East, so use of pentatonic scale, use of the octatonic scale, the whole tone scale, things that tend to sound foreign. I hate to use that word, but important things that we notice. Also with Rimsky-Korsakov, we're not talking about a composer, or the handful for that matter, that is noted for writing symphonies. Their works tend to have a different structure. They're put together with a different intent, which is not all that unlike many of the other nationalist composers. As I mentioned, Smetana is one that we're going to deal with of the Czech-speaking lands. Other people that frequently have that label assigned to them: Grieg from Norway, Sibelius from Finland, sometimes people such as Martinut being Czech, but thinking of Enescu from Romania, another composer that sometimes we talk about as being a nationalist. So these works, because they tend to not be symphonies or in that sort of scope, tend to have different inspiration and different material. And I thought that the perfect one to use is really Smetana's second movement from his great work, Ma Vlast. Now, I'm not going to get into much of Smetana's biography during this portion. I'll actually overlay some of that information in slides as we listen to excerpts from this work. But it's important to know that Smetana, by about 1848, there was a Prague uprising. The Czech people were under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in many ways the musicians of that time were considered very much a low-class member of society. We mentioned that with Tchaikovsky, that theater musicians held a particularly low role in their culture. In fact, when Carl Maria von Weber, the famous Germanic composer, was made head of opera in Prague, he actually learned Czech so that he could speak to the musicians, even though that language was largely considered banned during this time. So Smetana in 1848 attempted to write a couple of nationalistic works to capture the fever of this uprising within Prague. It largely didn't work out. But later in life, and this is about 1874, he turned his attention to what would eventually turn into a very large work involving 6 separate movements. And he wrote these in 3 sets of pairs, and the working title for the whole work was Ma Vlast, or My Homeland. And as I just mentioned, he started with an initial pair, and it was 2 of them. Ma Vlast, the first movement is Vyšehrad, which means the old castle, and the second movement, the Czech title, is Vltava. That's the name of their famous river that rolls right through Prague and much of the Czech-speaking lands. The Czech name is Vltava. The German name, which is the one that's more commonly associated with it, which I'm sure would drive Smetana crazy, was the Moldeau. Now, the other 4 movements are going to pay homage to important Czechs, also places, historic monuments within the city, within the countryside of Bohemia and Moravia, the area that we now think of today as Czech Republic, but used to be known as Czechoslovakia. So the very first movement is evocative of the great castle. Vyšehrad is the old castle, just the walls remain, and it's actually a cemetery now for many famous Czech cultural figures. Smetana and Dvorak are both buried there. And it starts with the harp, evoking the old bards entertaining the king and the palace entourage. So here's a little bit of the beginning of Vyšehrad. So that melody is going to be very important to the end of the second movement. Frequently, the second movement, Vltava, the Moldeau, is played by itself. But when that happens, we lose the context of the melody that we're going to see that appears at the very, very end. I had an opportunity to attend the Prague Spring Music Festival in 2002, and it starts in Smetana Hall on Smetana's birthday, with an orchestra playing the entire Ma Vlast, and that year it was the Czech Philharmonic. And I can remember as the harp started, I was in the standing room spots. It seemed as if the people around me just grew in stature, and I suddenly felt very short. And I was really taken by the pride in their country and their culture that the Czech people seem to have in that moment. It was just a special occurrence. So from Vyšehrad, we're going to turn our attention to Vltava, or the Moldeau. And this is probably the most famous and regularly played work of Czech nationalism. And it starts with just solitary voices that represent 2 springs, one warm water, one cold water, up in the high Tatra Mountains, that start with just individual notes from 2 flutes that will gradually unfold as these springs merge together into a small stream and eventually grow into the mighty river, which is the Moldeau, with a theme that you can't pass a street corner anywhere in Prague during tourist season and not hear this played by some collection of instruments. Now, as the river moves on through the Czech lands, it's going to work its way through a variety of different scenes. And all of these capture romantic ideals. We're dealing with nature, with the river. And the next two things that we're going to hear have to do with the river passing through, first of all, a forest where there are hunters out. And of course, for there to be hunters, there must be horns. So we're going to hear a horn call as people chasing through the woods. And then eventually it's going to make its way, the music is going to calm down, and it's going to make its way through a village. And there's a peasant wedding going on, complete with peasant dance. So after our peasant wedding, the river continues to work its way through a variety of other scenarios. The sun is going to set, the moon comes out, and we have the moonlit dance of the water sprites. The sun eventually comes back out. We go through the rapids of St. John, and then eventually the river reaches its widest point. And as no surprise, Smetana decided to take the minor key melody for the river and turn it into major to give the impression of the widest point of the river. Finally, the river makes its way into Prague and passes the old castle, and the melody that we heard so plaintively by harp at the beginning of Vyšehrad is now going to come back in full force with the entire orchestra playing as we wind down the Moldeau or Vltava. So that's a few excerpts from Smetana's great Vltava, the Moldeau, from Ma Vlast, My Homeland. And I think it's important to note that these sorts of works, while very inspired and very tuneful, tend to be, I think the critics would say, lacking in structure or sometimes craftsmanship. So where it may lack in those items, it certainly makes up for with inspiration and some creativity. But it also brings to mind this idea of nationalism being a little bit of a negative term. I think I mentioned in class at the beginning of the semester, once upon a time, having dinner with a Martinu scholar, a Czech composer from the beginning of the 20th century. And he was actually, this individual was somebody who was chronicling all of Martinu's works, the way that Dr. Kerschel cataloged all of Mozart's works. And he suggested the theory that perhaps the heir apparent to Beethoven, the great symphonist of the latter portion of the 19th century, was a composer who drew upon traditional idioms of his surrounding area. His name was Dvorak. By the way, there was a very nice nationalist composer over in Bavaria. His name was Brahms. Now, that's a point of view that he felt maybe had music history been written by the Czechs as opposed to by the German culture, that maybe that's the way we would remember these different composers. It's an interesting thought, maybe not completely accurate, but it's one way to look at how nationalism has been used to sort of brand composers who weren't of German descent and therefore somehow diminishing their skill, which I think is a shame. Antonin Dvorak is one of the great composers of the mid to late 19th century. He was born, 1841 to 1904, which makes him almost a direct contemporary to Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky, born just a year before Dvorak, passing away about 10 years before. He was born just outside of Prague. His father, in addition to being an innkeeper and a butcher, was actually a very talented professional folk musician and a master of the zither, so that Dvorak grew up in a very musical household. And I should mention that Czech education to this day emphasizes music and culture. And as we talked about in classical harmony music, the idea that many of the court musicians, particularly the wind section of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were of Czech descent because of the way that wind instruments were taught throughout Czech history. So Dvorak starts life as a theater musician, and this provides him with some exposure to some great composers and their works, particularly operatic works. And apparently, as a young man, he had an opportunity to play under the baton of Richard Wagner in one of his works, and that had a very significant impact on the works that he would eventually create. In 1871, so now at the age of 30, he leaves the court. In 1861, he firmly identifies himself as being a composer. He puts Opus 1 on a string quartet and starts creating a large body of works for chamber ensembles as well as full symphonic works that we'll deal with in a bit. In 1871, he actually left the theater orchestra in order to compose and then just took on church music work as an organist. And it was in 1874 that he entered in and actually won the Austrian State Prize. Unbeknownst to him, Johannes Brahms, as well as the famous critic Hanslick, were both on the panel. In fact, he would win again in both 1876 and in 1877. And it was after that third victory that the critic and Brahms himself identified themselves to Dvorak, and in fact, Brahms started championing Dvorak's music, including with his publisher, Simrock, who would actually take on publications for a lot of Dvorak's works. His international fame would take off from that point. So during the 1880s and into the 1890s, he has an opportunity to travel extensively. At Tchaikovsky's invitation, he goes to Russia, conducts and performs some of his own works, makes his way to London. And then finally in 1892, he is persuaded to take over the directorship of the National Conservatory of New York. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail when we actually get to the New World Symphony. So, Dvorak's music, what is it that makes him so unique and so special? I would suggest that of all of the composers who have been labeled a nationalist, he is one of the very few, along with maybe only Sibelius, who's able to take a nationalist aesthetic, this idea of traditional folk tunes and rhythms, and work them into larger symphonic works, particularly symphonies. Dvorak wrote 9 symphonies. Curiously, it used to be that you would find editions of what we now know as the 8th and the 9th symphonies that were labeled as 4 and 5. A number of his student works or younger works were undiscovered for a long period of time. But like Beethoven before him, he actually wrote 9 symphonies. We can divide his period up into 3 different categories, roughly. If we were to say that everything prior to 1875 has a strong Wagnerian influence, and then starting around 1875 we see a real national bent. That's where we're going to see some of the symphonies, but particularly things like the Serenade for Strings, the Serenade for Wind Instruments, a work for chamber orchestra called the Czech Suite, and the always popular Slavonic dances are very representative of this time period. And then the later style, the Stedman book talks about being very related or very influenced by Brahms. I think that Dvorak continues to evolve as a composer and very much has his own language. Sort of unusual, we think of composers during the 19th century as dividing themselves into absolutists, such as Brahms, or more progressive composers of program music. Liszt and Berlioz were 2 that we've already seen. Dvorak's actually going to write 9 symphonies, as well as 5 symphonic poems, which are all based, almost all based, on Czech literature, Czech folk literature, and then also 3 concert overtures that are programmatic in very much the way that Mendelssohn's were. So Dvorak doesn't really choose a camp out of those 2. He writes in both styles. Some characteristics to know about Dvorak's music. None is more important than we're going to find frequent use of folk material. Czech melodies, Czech rhythms are going to be found throughout his works. Even the New World Symphony, which many people talk about as having an American influence, while the melodies might sound a bit more American, a lot of the transition material is provided based on Czech influences, particularly the rhythms. His counterpoint is, well, he doesn't use counterpoint. It pretty much doesn't exist. On occasion we'll have melody and counter melody. That's really as close as he gets to it. And this is one of the reasons that sometimes he's looked at a little bit more dismissively as opposed to his contemporary Brahms. His harmonic motion can be very unique. If there's one recurring thing that you can expect to hear in a Dvorak work, it would be an almost immediate statement of something in major that is followed almost immediately in minor. And that's a hallmark of his sound. Also sort of unusual harmonic motion, if you think of the chords that open the second movement of the Ninth Symphony. His orchestration, I'm going to take great issue with the Stedman text. Dvorak was a very unique orchestrator. He was not afraid to write for solo winds in unusual ranges. Flute in its low register. We're going to see an excerpt of the beautiful melody of the second movement of the New World Symphony that's very much in the upper register of that instrument. But he also wasn't afraid to write for wind instruments in unusual pairings, where he would actually call for these instruments to be written in unison together. And this is largely considered not acceptable by the orchestration books, yet Schubert did it very successfully in the unfinished symphony, and Dvorak does it regularly throughout his works. And I guess the last thing that I would point out is, maybe in a more overt way than any other composer I can think of, you can hear where Dvorak is profoundly influenced by other great composers. There are stretches and melodies and accompanying passages that are nearly verbatim Wagner. Same too with Beethoven. The idea of gestures from Schubert or Brahms, or rhythms from some of those composers, not at all surprising. And I think this again doesn't do Dvorak a justice when people refer to it as being derivative or less talented version of these other composers. I think that largely he's able to incorporate these ideas into a unique language, but sometimes it's a bit more overt than we would find with some other composers. If we were to look at the 9 symphonies, we're going to see the influence of Beethoven. The idea of motivic development is going to be very important to Dvorak, along with these other qualities that we just talked about. His first 6 symphonies are a more mixed bag of strong Wagnerian influence and then influence of Brahms and Schubert, but he really comes into his own for the last 3. And I think that if you were to check out 3 of Dvorak's symphonies, they should absolutely be number 7, which is in D minor, completed in 1885, number 8 in G major, which was completed in 1889, and last but certainly not least, 1893 with the New World Symphony in E minor. The 9th Symphony, as I just mentioned, written in 1893, was written during the time that Dvorak had actually come to the U.S. By the beginning of the 1890s, he was widely known around the world. And there was a woman named Jeanette Myers Thurber who had the idea of a National Conservatory of American Music and asked Dvorak to head that up. And Dvorak, with his interest in folk music, agreed to it. Plus, he was paid a huge sum. I think it was around $15,000, which back then would have been an astronomical fee. So he arrives in New York and is very eager to become acquainted with African American as well as Native American music. And one of the things that's really not talked about very much is that within this conservatory, at a time when this was widely not acceptable, there were students of a wide variety of ethnic backgrounds, including African American and Native American students. This was an insistence that Mrs. Thurber had, and Dvorak was very eager to oblige. In fact, one of the most influential students that he would have was an African American composer and singer who actually probably had some strong influences on some of the themes that we're going to hear in the New World Symphony. So we're going to start with the end of the introduction and the beginning of the first movement. And I'm starting here because through the introduction, which is prior to the start of the Sonata 4 movement, we're actually going to introduce an idea that will become the primary melodic idea of the first movement, and then will be revisited in each of the 3 movements that comes afterwards. So we're going to start with a slow introduction and then go straight into the exposition, where the horns are going to state that opening melody. This will eventually give way to a very rich exposition that involves 3 major themes. The one in the horns that I just mentioned. That's going to be followed by a modal theme. Some people talk about it as being minor key, but it's definitely with a lowered 7th, and I'll identify that with the slides that correspond, before we eventually end up with our 3rd theme, which has a strong resemblance to the African American spiritual Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. So this is the end of the introduction and the exposition of Dvorak's New World Symphony, first movement. So it goes straight into the development, and the development wanders very far afield harmonically. He seems to be starting the recap and actually surprises us with his harmonic motion. The recapitulation unfolds largely as we would expect it to, but some of the key choices are a little bit unusual. And then the coda, very rousing restatement of opening material, and a very explosive ending. The first movement is the required listening. Little anticlimactic, but you get the idea. The second movement doesn't really need any introduction. It's a melody that we've all heard numerous times. Certainly by the end of undergraduate and graduate studies for this class, it's a melody you're going to be well familiar with. The second movement has an interesting history in terms of what people have written about it. Contrary to popular belief, this was an original melody that Dvorak wrote. And there's a lot of speculation, I think pretty accurate, that the second and third movement have to do with a retelling of the Hiawatha tale, which incidentally was a subject that the director of the sponsor, the patroness of the National Conservatory, hoped that Dvorak would set to an opera. He sketched it out. It didn't really come to fruition. Apparently the libretto wasn't very good. The second movement starts with beautiful chords, almost as if to say, let me tell you a story. And that, of course, is echoed by the beautiful melody in the English horn. After a few more moments, we end up with a brief little recap and restatement of that English horn melody, and that's going to lead us into the second section of this second movement. So I'm going to play just a little bit of that last statement of the melody for you, and then that's going to take us into a very unusual sound world. We're going to have flute and oboe in unison playing just a beautiful melody that is then going to morph into a funeral march, not unlike maybe something from Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. And then immediately following that, we'll have this idea of counterpoint where, or at least theme and counter melody, where that melody that we heard in oboe and flute comes back, this time in the violin, with counter melody up above. There's some scoring that is absolutely unique and very important that we observe. So I'm going to put some information about that into the slides. Here's an excerpt from the second movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony. Just beautiful music, and the scoring is so inventive. At the end of this section, there's a little tribute to nature, and it's important to understand that as much as Dvorak enjoyed New York City, he was able to spend quite a bit of the following summer in Spillville, Iowa, where there was a large Czech community. His children even came to visit him. And he was really quite inspired by being around people who spoke his language. As we finish the second movement, there's another statement of that melody that we heard in the first movement, followed by just a gorgeous moment where the main tune that we first heard in the English horn is trying to sound through the strings, and it keeps dying away before the music sort of finds its footing again with the opening chords. We're going to move into the third movement now, and this starts with maybe a little bit too close to home of a statement of an idea that sounds very much like Beethoven. So very exciting music. A little bit of counterpoint. We've got the tune being stated in canon, which is about as contrapuntal as Dvorak would ever get. Now, I think it's important that we also listen to just a short excerpt from the trio. So in this scherzo, the trio is going to start with a modified version of the material that we heard as the main theme in the first movement, way back to that introduction. And then that's going to turn into a series of Czech dances. So that's a little taste of the third movement in two excerpts. Now we're going to turn our attention to the last movement of the New World Symphony. And this, like the first movement, is going to be in a very compelling sonata allegro form. And it starts very rambunctiously, something that I think John Williams, when writing the score for Jaws, must have been at least a little aware of. So after two statements of that opening melody, second one obviously featuring trumpet, we get into some almost demonic violin playing, fiddle music, before it dies away into a straight up Wagnerian clarinet solo, complete with low string arpeggios underneath, that is not the most original music that Dvorak has ever written, and shows some of this sort of overt influence of other composers. Following a very interesting development section and recapitulation, Dvorak has an epic coda in store for us, and I'd like for you to hear all of that. We're going to hear themes from each of the previous movements that are going to come back together before a almost bizarre ending. Sounds like maybe he'd attended a Big Ten football game or something, with a surprising last chord that dies away into nothing. So this is the very end of Dvorak's New World Symphony. So there we have it. Dvorak apparently was so excited that his children had arrived by train, he'd just gotten a cable, that he felt that he had finished the work and realized at the first rehearsal he had forgotten to write the trombone parts into the score, which obviously he finished that at some point in time, but just sort of a funny story. So that's our vlog on nationalism, this idea of celebrating folk music, folk idioms, whether it's tunes or dance rhythms or the unique sounds of one's homeland that was so prevalent during the 19th century. A little bit of a close look at works by Smetana and Dvorak.